devoted to crime and terrorism, so I'm well primed for the occasion. Started early this morning with a demonstration in support of a serious criminal, a young woman in her mid-20s who has 5 felony convictions. That's pretty serious. Her felony convictions were for crossing the border, fleeing from US-backed terror in Guatemala, in this case, indigenous woman, Mayan, one of many who is still fleeing, or still fleeing from the ravages of the US-backed genocidal war in the Guatemalan highlands in the early 1980s. Destruction, terror of the indigenous, to this day, are the most severely persecuted. This young woman got her 5 felony convictions for fleeing from that to the country that was responsible for the terror, which is now planning to deport her back, along with her 3-year-old son, back to to suffer the persecution and the violence that we have helped create. That's our mission in the world, might as well face it. First, destroy, devastate, terrorize, and then punish the victims. Cuban 5 is another case. The terrorism that this young woman was fleeing was actually 30 years ago, 1982. That was the year in Guatemala. The chief perpetrator of the terror, General Rios Montt, has just a couple of months ago been brought to trial, but we haven't reached that level of civilization. The man who was responsible for supporting him all the way through is hailed in the United States as, well, quote, Stanford's Hoover Institution, is hailed as a colossal figure whose spirit hovers over us like a warm and friendly ghost. Actually, his spirit hovers over a great many ghosts, many of them in Central America. It's Ronald Reagan, in case you didn't notice. That's how the day started. I'll skip several interviews on terrorism. I'll come to tonight. The topic of international terrorism hit the big time just a year before the horrendous atrocities in the Guatemalan highlands, which incidentally were just another stage in the 60 years of terror in Guatemala ever since the United States overthrew the democratic government in 1954. One of the early stages of international terrorism, modern international terrorism. And it happened at the peak of the 80s, along with many other terrorist acts. The 1980s were an extreme period of state-directed international terrorism, and particularly in Central America, but not only there. The state involved was the United States, which was supporting state terror, amateur terror, if you want to call it that, the Contras, Cubans, and so on, right through the 80s, and incidentally, not only in Central America. As I said, the topic hit the big time in 1981 when Ronald Reagan came into office and announced that international terrorism would be the primary focus of U.S. foreign policy, replacing the misguided emphasis on human rights, which wasn't much pursued, but was at least discussed. The terrorism, state-directed international terrorism, was a return to barbarism in the modern age, plague of our times, similar rhetoric, all pretty accurate. The 1980s actually ended a 30-year period of massive international terrorism, which is probably the most extreme in human history. It began in the early 60s with Cuba, went on, reached all plague, went right through Latin America, South America. 1980s, in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions probably of widows and orphans and wounded. Poor country was pretty much devastated, to the extent that people are still fleeing today and are guilty of felony for having done so and are in danger of being sent back. This young woman, along with her 3-year-old son, who was born here and is an American citizen, but that doesn't help. Well, is this terror? Well, to answer that question, you might look at what the definition of terrorism is. It's a highly contested issue, which is an interesting fact in itself, because they're quite simple and straightforward definitions. They're in the United States Code, in Army manuals, in United Nations declarations, in British law. I'll just read one typical one. This is a short, so I'll read it. It's from British law. And terrorism is the use or threat of action which is violent, damaging, or disrupting, and is intended to influence the government or intimidate the public, and is for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. That covers everything that Ronald Reagan was doing and the United States has been doing before him and since, and is continuing to do today. But the major international terrorist campaign that's now in operation, namely President Obama's drone campaign. And it wasn't just Latin America. As soon as Reagan announced the focus of U.S. foreign policy, international terrorism, that sparked enormous interest. The media picked it up. There were academic departments established that studied terrorism. There were international conferences, many volumes of learned debate about it. Much of it devoted to trying to define terrorism. If you look through this debate, it was recognized that defining terrorism is very hard, and to this day a satisfactory definition hasn't been reached. And there's a reason. The definition I just gave, which is the one that's in the legal codes, won't work. If you think about it for a minute, you see why. According to that definition, the leading terrorist state in the world is the United States. And obviously that's impossible, so there's got to be something wrong with the definition of terrorism. So therefore, we've had 30 years of sober, intense discussion among learned, serious scholars and others about how to define terrorism in such a way that it applies to what they do to us, but doesn't apply to what we do to them. And that's not simple. You might try. To this day, nobody has found a satisfactory answer. So terrorism's a tricky concept. As I mentioned, the media immediately picked it up in the early 80s after Reagan announced that the war on terror would be the center of our foreign policy. And right through the 80s, the leading stories in the media were about terrorism. Peaked in 1985. The Associated Press does a study of editors, reviews editors and their opinions about the most important story. 1985, Middle East terrorism was picked as the leading story of the year. And it was a serious issue. There actually were 2 cases of terrorism which were pointed out, in each of which an American was killed. So that's 2 Americans killed. Pretty serious terrorism, but not like 200,000 Central Americans. Actually, those weren't the only cases of Middle East terrorism in 1985. There were several others, but they didn't meet the criterion of proper choice of agent. So, for example, one was in 1985 the worst car bombing in the history of Lebanon. It was a truck bomb, actually. Truck bombing was right outside a mosque, timed to go off when people were leaving the mosque so as to cause maximum casualties. It was aimed at a Muslim cleric, missed him. But it did kill about 80 people, mostly women and girls, leaving the mosque, caused hundreds of casualties. Well, that didn't make it to the annals of terrorism because it was organized by the CIA with the help of Saudi intelligence. So therefore, it suffered from the fallacy of wrong agency, which sharply narrows the category of terrorism in the literature on the topic. 1982, the same year as the genocidal assault in the Mayan Highlands, another critical event took place in the history of terrorism. Someone was removed from the U.S. government terrorist list. The U.S. government has a list of official terrorists. The person who was removed was Saddam Hussein. He had to be removed so that the U.S. could then provide him with substantial support, along with U.S. allies, for his war against Iran, which is the worst use of chemical weapons in modern history outside the Holocaust, all supported by the United States, partly in the war against Iran, but also against this Kurdish population, horrible atrocities backed by the United States, and he couldn't support them if he was on the terrorist list, so he was taken off. Throughout these atrocities, he was a favorite of the U.S. government, so much admired that at the end of the whole decade of horror, the president, who was then George Bush I, the statesman-like Bush, invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. That was 1989. That's a real privilege. Saddam got another privilege, which is unusual. He is the only leader outside of Israel who was entitled to attack a U.S. ship and kill several dozen crewmen and get away with a tap on the wrist. In the Israeli case, it's U.S. Liberty. In Saddam's case, it was USS Stark in 1988. But since he was a nice guy, he did not do anything about it. Well, when Saddam was taken off the terrorist list, there was a gap, and it had to be filled. And the obvious country to fill it was Cuba. That they were put on the terrorist list to replace Saddam, which made a lot of sense. In the previous few years, the terrorism against Cuba, which had started in the early 60s, had peaked. That included the destruction of the Cuban airliner, which you just heard about, with 73 people killed, bombings of embassies, and other terrorist acts throughout the world. So since Cuba was the leading target of terrorism, all backed by the United States, it made sense for them to be placed on the terrorist list to replace Saddam Hussein, who had to be removed so that we could support his ongoing benevolent actions. The terrorism against Cuba goes back to the moment of liberation, practically. Theoretically, in U.S. history, it's claimed that Cuba was liberated with the help of the United States in 1898, liberated from Spain. In fact, the intervention in 1898 was undertaken to prevent Cuba from liberating itself from Spain, as it was about to do. Cuba was turned into a virtual colony, remained that way until 1959, January 1959, when Castro took over. Within months, the U.S. was committed to overthrow the government. The bombing of Cuba started a couple of months later. By March 1960, there was a formal declaration to overthrow the government, secret at the time. It's been declassified since. A harsh embargo was instituted. Now, the purpose of the embargo was to cause desperation, hunger, and incite the population to overthrow the government. You'll notice that that fits quite well with the definition of terrorism that I mentioned. It's a perfect case of terrorism. It's going on until today. It's unilateral, condemned by the whole world, but it doesn't matter. This is an important issue. right after that was Eisenhower. Kennedy came in. It all intensified. First came the Bay of Pigs invasion. After the failure of that, there was almost total hysteria in the White House. It's described by memoirists as a moment of fanaticism. They didn't know what to do about it. They had to do something to overcome the fact that Cuba had beaten back the Bay of Pigs invasion. And what was done was to escalate the embargo, but also to launch a major terrorist war. Operation Mongoose was launched at the time. It was under the authority of the president's brother, Robert Kennedy. It was his primary commitment in the government. And in fact, as he repeatedly declared, overthrowing the government of Cuba is the highest priority for Washington. We have to do that by any means necessary. And a major terrorist war was launched. It was no joke. Very serious terrorist attacks on the island, sinking of fishing boats, bombing hotels. Actually, the worst of the many crimes, the worst of them was blowing up of a petrochemical complex with about 400 people killed. This was at a particularly tense moment. It was 2 weeks after the end of the missile crisis, when there were negotiations going on between Russia and the United States as to how to extricate themselves from a situation which almost blew up the world, came very close to it, very delicate. Right at that moment, when the Mongoose operations blew up the petrochemical plant, the Russians could have concluded and probably thought that the United States was backing out of the agreement, that we might have gone on to nuclear war. That was maybe the worst case, but there were many others. This Operation Mongoose started in 1961, had plans. The plan of Operation Mongoose, probably known to the Cubans and the Russians, was to lead to an uprising in October 1962, which would be an occasion for the United States to invade. That was to happen in October 1962. Well, something else happened in October 1962. The Russians put missiles in Cuba, nuclear missiles. That led to what the president's, one of the president's advisors, historian Arthur Schlesinger, called the most dangerous moment in history. We came very close to a nuclear war. The issue, I won't go into the details, but it was one of the main reasons for putting the missiles in Cuba was the threatened invasion at the end of this terrorist operation. An operation which was undertaken to quote Schlesinger again, to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That was the mission of the Robert Kennedy-led operation. Well, after the missile crisis, it continued. President Johnson actually stopped it for a couple of years, but it was picked up again under Nixon. It goes on till the president, you've heard the last stage. Cuba has been the target of more international terrorism probably than every country in the world combined. It went on, still going on, in fact. And the perpetrators are living happily in Washington and Miami. In Miami, the two people responsible, presumed to be responsible for the blowing up of the Cuban airliner and many other acts of terror, Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada, have resided peacefully under U.S. protection. Bosch died recently. Posada's still there. There is something called the Bush Doctrine, Bush number 2, which is that countries that harbor terrorists are indistinguishable from the terrorists themselves. This is described as a de facto law of international relations by Harvard University's international relations specialist, Graham Allison. And it makes sense, but of course it has the usual exception. It's true unless the country that's harboring terrorists is the United States, the leading terrorist